This is Block 11, Reagan's Revolution, Part 4, Reagan's Cold War, with the section beginning America's military buildup. Reagan's strategic plan to defeat the Soviet Union involved spending them to death, spending the Soviet Union into an economic and then political collapse. And the plan is incredibly simple. Reagan knew that the matrix of the Cold War, the competition between the superpowers, demanded that if the United States increased its military spending, then the Soviet Union would have to increase theirs. That the Soviet Union could not afford to fall further and further behind the United States in terms of size of military, military buildup, etc., etc., etc. So any new spending, any new technology that the United States developed, the Soviet Union would be forced to try to keep up with that technology and that spending. Reagan also knew that the Soviet economy was very, very weak. It was not a strong economy at all. That already in 1980, the Soviet Union is dedicating over a third of its total resources to military spending, while the United States was about 5%. And he knew that the United States could afford to spend a lot more money on its military. And Reagan said, we're going to ramp up military spending. Not only, we're going to get ourselves out of these post-Vietnam doldrums, we are going to show the Soviet Union we need business. And when the United States ramped up its military spending, Reagan knew that the Soviet Union would be forced to do the same thing. Reagan knew that the Soviet Union couldn't even feed itself, and that an increase in military spending would mean even less money for civilian necessities, which would help collapse the economy, anger the people against their government, and bring about political changes in the Soviet Union that would be beneficial to the United States. The Soviet military, as strong as it was, its civilian sector was notoriously inefficient, to the point almost of a joke. That Soviet citizens had to stand on line for basic foodstuffs for hours upon hours a week. That, it was if you were a Soviet citizen, you'd have to stand in the bread line for 4 or 5 hours once a week to get your bread for the week. And you'd have to stand on another line for 4 or 5 hours for your small, ration of milk. And then another line for your small ration of gasoline. The waiting list to purchase your own automobile was about 20 years. That if you had the money for an automobile, you paid your money for your car, and it would be delivered 20 years later. So it's a notoriously inefficient, corrupt, command, centralized plan, civilian sector of their economy. So Reagan is going to try to spend the Soviet Union into changes that will benefit the United States. So Reagan ramps up military spending by tens of billions of dollars immediately, up from about 5% of American gross national product to about 7.5% of American gross domestic product. That goes a lot of different places. New weapons are developed, including the stealth fighter, the stealth bomber that you might be familiar with. New ships were built, new tanks were designed and produced. There was finally, for the first time since Vietnam, enough spare parts, enough money for training. New satellites were launched, and even the troops themselves got raises. So Reagan's kind of turning the screws here. He knows that of all this stuff that the United States is starting to produce and invest in, the Soviet Union has to do the same thing. Reagan then went and positioned intermediate-range nuclear missiles in NATO countries. And he said, this is another thing, that, if the United States has missiles like that in Western Europe, the Soviets are going to have to counter. Missiles, start to become expensive. Just the pressure is on. The anti-war movement got kicked into gear again. This chart, what we see here, this section of the chart right here, is Reagan's military buildup. This is the national defense budget in 2000, so it's equivalent for modern amounts of money. And you can see that when Reagan took office here in 1981, defense spending had remained stable since kind of Vietnamization in the late 1960s. And then Reagan expanded it very, very quickly over a period of 2 or 3 years to a peak which, again was not seen until the surge in Iraq in 2007. And the post 9/11 world right here. So anyway, I'm sorry. Reagan's positioning of missiles in Western Europe got the anti-war crowd going again. This time it was called the Nuclear Freeze Movement. The anti-war demonstrators protested against the addition of more nuclear weapons into Western Europe. That not only now did you have those big giant missiles that would fly, from the Soviet Union and the United States over the poles to attack the Soviet Union and the United States, there were now Soviet and American missiles in Western European countries like Germany especially, but Italy and the United Kingdom. And there was, significant marches. Again, freeze the arms race, fund human needs, better active today than radioactive tomorrow. So they're not quite as big as the crowds against the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, but they certainly made themselves heard. Reagan had no time, to be perfectly honest, for these people. He had dealt with these people as governor of California, and he pretty much ignored them. Reagan's military buildup made, his Democratic opponents and liberals and progressives especially, they were aghast. They could not believe it. They called Reagan a cowboy, a dunce under the influence of evil men, a warmonger, trigger happy, that he was clearly leading the world. For some reason, Reagan was inviting World War III. He wanted it. And Reagan's response to them, the argument that, his opponents made was that if you want to reduce the amount of arms, then you reduce the amount of arms, that you can't, that the United States should lead by example, that if the United States wants other countries to disarm, the United States should set an example and reduce our number of weapons first. Reagan's response to that is that only through strength could peace be certain, that you have to be so strong that nobody dares pick on you. And that's kind of, those two beliefs define a big difference between a conservative and a liberal worldview, a conservative and a progressive worldview. The Soviets knew that they could not keep up, so they encouraged the nuclear freeze crowd. These protesters, a lot of them, like the anti-war protesters of the 60s, were idealists. They genuinely were worried about the future of the world, but the Soviet Union encouraged them, paid them. There was, lots of traitors in the 70s and 80s, just like there were in the 40s and 50s. And they encouraged these domestic groups fighting against Reagan's military buildup, and they raised their own military spending as much as possible in an attempt to keep up. The crowning idea of Reagan's defense buildup is known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, and popularly called Star Wars, after, obviously the early 80s is when the Star Wars movies had come out, and they were, big deals, obviously. We've talked about this before. Basically, what strategic defense is the ability to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles coming. So here's a missile, an ICBM, fired from the Soviet Union. It goes over the poles, and it's going to land, boom, in the United States. And there's lots of different ways. A strategic defense is the ability to destroy those missiles in flight. And you can either destroy them, as we can see here, by satellites in their launch phase. Here's kind of American satellites that would shoot them down with lasers as they came into the atmosphere. Satellites could track and shoot them down in their period flying through space up here. And then air-based and ground-based and ship-based anti-missile missiles could shoot them down either in their going up phase or their going down phase. Reagan likes the idea of strategic defense because he does not like the concept of mutually assured destruction. He realizes that if a country could deploy a strategic defense, then that country would be impervious to nuclear attack. And if all countries develop this, nuclear weapons would become obsolete. And that's kind of was Reagan's long-term goal here, that he genuinely detested nuclear weapons. The only problem is if you're afraid of a first... Now let's go. We have to go back to Block 8. What does a nuclear exchange look like? one side fires first, the other side has to have enough missiles left to retaliate. But if you cannot be retaliated against, if the United States has a strategic defense system in place, then it can afford to fire a first strike. That American nuclear weapons can fly with no warning against the Soviet Union, blast the Soviets to smithereens, and then all the missiles that the Soviets have left get fired in a second strike, but the strategic defense system destroys those missiles in flight, and all of a sudden nuclear war has become winnable. That's what worries the Soviets. That's what freaks out Reagan's progressive detractors. They say, Ronald Reagan, they honestly believe this, that Ronald Reagan was interested in starting a war with the Soviet Union, that he called the Soviets the evil empire, the focus of evil in the modern world. He hated communism, and now he's trying to develop a system to actually make nuclear war winnable. The critics said that, so that was one criticism. Another criticism is more scientific and engineering based. They said, first of all, it's the critics that named it Star Wars. They said this is a fantasy. That all of this imagine the technology and the computing power needed to shoot down a missile going, 30 times the speed of sound with another missile. It's like trying to hit a flying needle with another flying needle. They said it's impossible. That the United States is going to be spending these tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on a system that cannot possibly work in the first place. And they called it Star Wars, that it was a fantasy. And they were right in one regard. To develop a system is technologically incredibly, incredibly difficult. But this is what Reagan knew. He said, look, in the end, the United States can afford to try to solve these technological and engineering problems. The Soviets couldn't. The Soviets would have to try. The Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union knew that the United States was working on strategic defense, the Soviets would have to try to keep up, but their computer technology was not as good, their economy was not as strong, and this is the best way that Reagan has to spend the Soviets into submission and into a position to negotiate. When it came time to actually negotiate with the Soviets were willing to give up lots of things, huge concessions, if the United States would stop researching SDI, but Reagan did not budge. Reagan did not flinch. He knew that the United States spending money on missile defense, even though it was never deployed, and still today it's incredibly technologically difficult, Reagan knew just by the fact that the United States was studying it, working on it, the Soviets would have to also. Because the last thing the Soviet Union wanted was for the United States to have an anti-missile system and them not. So when they knew Reagan was spending money on it, they had to spend money on the research development as well. All of this military buildup kept the screws on the Soviet economy, kept the screws on Soviet politicians, kept the screws on the Soviet society until the whole Soviet system began to clank and crash and crumble and rumble to a standstill. And then it would be time for the Soviets to get a new leader, one who was willing to be flexible, one who was willing to negotiate, a person that Ronald Reagan and the United States could work with.